Started. Welcome this afternoon to our birthday symposium for Bob Conn. Many of you, most of you, know Bob quite well. There's a few students in the audience. Bob, I should say, I sent an email this morning to our group reminding them of this event and saying that they should come if they wanted to hear the story of the origins of where we all came from in the plasma group here at UC San Diego. So a number of them are here. Bob began his career in Wisconsin in 1970, I believe it was. And if you're not familiar with that work, those were sort of engineering system studies that led to the evaluation of the feasibility of fusion as a potential energy source. And those were some of the first attempts at trying to look at the self-consistent technology and physics of such systems. And that sort of work continues to this day. And so we thought, because that's where Bob spent the beginning part of his career, then as he transitioned to UCLA, that work grew in scope and scale. We thought that it made sense to focus this afternoon's comments and discussion about those early days in his own work and its implications for that field even today. And then tomorrow, turn our attention to his work that he did here in the San Diego region when he left UCLA in, was it 93, as I'm recalling correctly? And took on the role as dean of the School of Engineering, then to be later named the Jacobs School, which underwent extraordinary growth during the period of the mid and late 1990s, as UC San Diego really became to preeminence in engineering, both within the state and the country. So tomorrow's discussion will focus on his work here in institution building and helping the School of Engineering come to the fore at UC San Diego. And this afternoon we'll look at fusion energy, the physics, the technology, and the policy issues that revolve around this country's work in taking fusion to an energy source. So I am George Tynan, professor in mechanical and aerospace engineering. Caveat emptor, I was one of Bob's graduate students back in the late 80s, early 90s. Anyway, that's my connection to Bob, and it's been a pleasure to work with him for, a long time, 25 or more years. So our speakers this afternoon, I'll introduce each today now and then sort of call on them as we proceed. The first is Jerry Kulcinski, who is the Grainger Professor of Nuclear Engineering and the Director of the Fusion Technology Institute at University of Wisconsin-Madison. He and Bob worked together in those long ago days on system studies, and Jerry continues to be a leader in that area today. Steve Dean, who's the president of the Fusion Power Associates and editor of the Journal of Fusion Energy. Stephen will speak, and he and Bob, I believe, had a connection in those early days. Steve was at the Department of Energy, if it was maybe called it something different at that era. But nonetheless, Stephen had a connection with Bob in shaping the growth of the fusion program that occurred in those days. Mohamed Abdou is a distinguished professor of engineering and applied science at UCLA and director of the Fusion Science and Technology Center. Mohamed will share his thoughts about working together with Bob in those days, both at Madison and then later at UCLA. Farrokh Najmabadi, who is on the faculty here at San Diego, is a professor in electrical and computer engineering and director of UC San Diego's Center for Energy Research, which is one of the two ORUs helping to put together this event today. Charles Baker, who's a former director of the fusion program at Argonne National Lab in Oak Ridge and a former associate director of fusion energy here at Jacobs School, and was the U.S. team leader of as students, and then and also talk a little bit about the key role of clean energy going forward into the future. And then finally, we invited Charlie Kennel, who is Distinguished Professor Emeritus, former Director of Scripps Institution of Oceanography, to say some words. Charlie's connection to Bob go back to the UCLA days when Charlie was on the faculty in physics. His own particular research area is plasma physics. And so obviously those of us in fusion had a connection to the sort of work that Charlie did. And so he and Bob back in the 80s, I guess it was 90s, no 80s. I'm losing a decade, it's easy to do now. Charlie and Bob were instrumental in putting together an Institute for Plasma and Fusion Research at Los Angeles back in those days. So I invited Charlie to say a few words to put fusion into context for those of you who are not familiar with fusion and its role in the potential energy future. So that's our program for today, and with that, I'd like to welcome you all. Thank you for coming, and invite Jerry Kulcinski to come up and share his thoughts.
Their regards and congratulations for this great milestone. And those of our students and new faculty who didn't know you have learned a lot about you in the last couple of weeks because we've been telling them about you. So they all send their regards. I'm just going to run through a few old slides just to give you a flavor of some of the things that Bob did in his early career. Bob has had a tremendous impact on the fusion program back at University of Wisconsin, which is continuing to this day. And a lot of our program owes its origin to the great work that Bob did when he first came. And then after he left, we had a lot of other collaborations together. So I will just run through a few pictures. By the way, this is the campus that Bob was at from 1970 to 1980. His original home was in that building. Now, to tell you how long ago this was, at the time that Bob was there, that was the newest building on the engineering campus. Now it's the oldest. The rest of them we've pretty well either torn down or remodeled. But anyhow, Bob, you remember that building. Close to the stadium, so we always had fun with that. Bob's history at the university, first of all, just as was said before, he started in 1970 in the nuclear engineering department, and he was visiting associate professor, which then very quickly went to associate and full and moved very quickly up the chain. Together with Max Carbon, Harold Forson, Charlie Maynard, and myself, we started the fusion technology program in 1972, but it really had its origins very soon after Bob got there, and then various other people came on later. But Bob was an originator in that thought. He published 96 articles while he was there, 39 as a lead author and 57 as a co-author, and he actually published a lot, both on plasma physics and technology. His 12 graduate students, and I hope I've got them right, Bob, these are the ones we had to go back and we don't keep records anymore back to that age, and so we had to dig. Those are the 12 PhD graduates that he had in the 10 years that he was at the university. You recognize a lot of the names. Some of the people are here in the audience today. And then, unfortunately, our loss was UCLA's gain. He left to get to the warmer climes of California and started another fusion program up in UCLA, which was highly successful, and you'll hear about that, I'm sure, in a few moments. Now, here's an old picture, 1974. This was the original group, minus the students. We didn't have all the students in that particular picture. I couldn't find the one with the students, Bob, but you'll recognize Don Kirst, who is off to his right, and there's a young Mohamed Abdou. And you can see lots of other folks here who you probably run across. I won't go through them all, otherwise we'll be here for quite a while. The next picture I was able to find was in 1975. Now, you were complaining, Bob, about the hair, right? See, so... Okay. This was in 1975. We had a lot of the students in there, and you can also see some of the faces. Here again is a few of the folks who are in the audience today. Of course, Bob was a big hit in Madison, poster boy in this case for fusion, and the Wisconsin State Journal did a nice big spread on him in 1978. And then the last picture that I could find, Bob, of you with the whole group was in 1979. And you can look through the faces there. Bob will recognize most of them. I'm not sure all of you in the audience will, but all of these folks have moved on to other places. A few are still back in Madison and continuing the program that Bob initiated. I put this one in, Bob, because you remember when we used to have 4 assistants to write and type our papers and reports. Nowadays, we get by with 1, and she's not always busy either. So the efficiency improvements are really tremendous. But this is a great crew, and we sort of lost something when we didn't have that many around to help the work that we did. One of the first seminal publications, and I do believe probably the one that had the most impact in the early days of fusion, was the UMAC-1 study that George referred to. We started that out as very much a tutorial, so that it would contain all of the parts of a design of a fusion reactor, all the way from plasma physics to the technology, materials, cost, environment, and so forth. And it was highly successful because several businesses actually picked up that document and used it as a tutorial for their staff, in particular McDonnell Douglas, I remember, and Westinghouse and others. And so it did have a big impact. Bob, of course, was one of the authors, but one of the main authors of that report. And there was a guy, an author named B. Badger, who was on he was a lead, he was pretty famous. He actually had 23 full fusion facility designs that he was the lead author on. Well, I think it was the mid or the late 1970s, we were hosting an IAEA conference on reactor design, fusion reactor design. And the Russians came up to Bob and said they really wanted to meet B. Badger, one of the more proliferate publishers in our reports. Well, Bob thought very quickly, and right after the banquet was over, he brought in B. Badger. And who is B. Badger? Well, that's B. Badger, Bucky Badger, of course. And it had a serious side because Bob and I decided that we should have at least the initial reports authored by somebody who was more a representative than a John Jones or Mary Smith or something like that. And that worked out very well, and it really contributed a lot to the team effort. And if there's one thing, Bob, I think that you did leave at Wisconsin was this idea of team, and we all have tried to carry that forward as much as we could. Bob actually participated in more than UMAC-1. Now, don't laugh at the graphics. This is 1970s graphics. We didn't have the CAD systems in those days, and this is about the best we could do. But we had the UMAC series, UMAC 1, 2, and 3. We actually, I think, designed the first materials tokamak test reactor. And then there was we threw all the new ideas into something called NUMAC. And then we made a foray into the inertial side of the house. If you remember, in those days, the labs would tell us that we couldn't do that because the targets were classified. And we said, well, we'll just treat them as a black box and we can do everything else. And Bob and I had many conversations with Livermore folks about why we couldn't do this, but we did anyhow. And then he also was a lead in the Soleil's H, which is a hybrid reactor. So in his short time period at Wisconsin, he had a tremendous impact on the fusion reactor design community. Now that's continued, Bob. From the time that we did those initial studies, we now are up to about 43 magnetic fusion studies that the group that you helped start has participated in. And in the inertial fusion area, there's another 26. So about 70 fusion reactor studies came out of that original program that Bob was instrumental in putting together. Also, since our job at Wisconsin was to educate students, When Bob left the university, we had reached a cumulative number of PhDs of about 100. Actually, it was almost exactly 100 at the time. And they were both in the theory and experimental, but the fusion technology graduates started to increase, and by the time Bob left, we had about 25 graduates in fusion technology. That has continued, Bob, so that now we just last year graduated our 400th PhD in the fusion program. So this is an outgrowth of your original input, Bob, and we hope to continue that if the federal government doesn't go away. But we now have 133 people who have gotten PhDs in fusion technology. Who would have ever thought in those early days we'd ever get to that number? But that's a real tribute to Bob's work. They're all over the world. These balloons, any one of those on our website you can actually click on and you'll find 10, 15 students at a various location, especially in the United States. So the impact was not only locally at Wisconsin, but it was all over the world. And if you look at where our students have gone, and Bob's students went to, in all of these areas around the United States, they were pretty well distributed between industry, academia, government, and a few other institutions, but mainly those three. And it was almost a third, which we didn't try to do, but it actually happened that way. And I think that was a good outcome from what we were doing. So, Bob, we wish you a happy birthday. This is our recent crew. Some of the faces you will remember. There aren't many left, but there are a few. And before I leave, I have got one request to you. I want you to come back sometime in the winter so you can remember how much fun it was to be in the snow. So, congratulations.
Back in those halcyon days, and is currently leading the Fusion Power Associates and editor of Journal of Fusion Energy. Steve.
We got my cover slide to go up there. What do I do?
I just heard someone's voice. I was told they're on the computers. There we go.
Okay. Well, it's a great honor and pleasure for me to be here to wish Bob a happy birthday. I wasn't quite sure why one gets a big party when he's only 70. My birthday is this Sunday, actually. I'll be 77. So the first thing I wanted to do was thank you all for coming to help me celebrate my birthday. The other thing was when George asked me if I would speak, I wasn't quite sure what the nature of the event would be. I didn't know if it was a roast, or then I thought, well, we're all kind of up there in years. Maybe it's that old television program. Some of you may remember, This Is Your Life. I mean, Bob Conn, This Is Your Life. You know, you bring up all these people's old friends and they tell stories about you, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll do a little bit, I guess, of all of that while we're here. Seven years, to be exact. I joined the Atomic Energy Commission in 1962, and I calculated, you see, I can still calculate, Bob was only 19 years old at that point. Some people think there was no fusion at Wisconsin before Bob and Jerry, but actually, as Jerry sort of indicated, there was. In fact, in the 60s, while I was there, the General Atomics program, which was out here and was privately funded, kind of collapsed. And most of the people that were there left and went other places except for Tahiro. And one of the persons that left was Don Kirst, who went to Wisconsin. During the mid-'60s, I actually went to a short course that Harold Forson organized at Wisconsin. But Bob had not yet arrived there. He actually was busy, though, during that period. He was actually studying chemical engineering at the Pratt Institute, getting his master's and his PhD from Caltech. I don't have any information on any of that, but somehow or another he got through it all. And in 1970, as Jerry mentioned, Bob arrived at Wisconsin. That was a very fortuitous time to arrive at the start of your real career, because like a year before that, after a whole couple of decades of not being able to confine plasmas very well, the Russians had demonstrated to everybody's satisfaction that tokamaks were much better at confining plasmas. And Bob arrived about a year after this British team went over to the Kurchatov and verified the Russian results of enhanced confinement in the T3. And as a result of that, the world fusion effort began to jump on the tokamak bandwagon, and that's the bandwagon we're still on today. I became director of the AEC Magnetic Confinement Fusion Division in 1972, and I met Bob shortly after that, and I became even more aware of the activities at the University of Wisconsin. As Jerry mentioned, during the 1970s, the series of UMAC power plant designs and other designs that Bob and Jerry and others at Wisconsin, these became key elements in the fusion energy development strategy that we were putting together in the 70s, because they provided a concrete vision of a commercial fusion power plant, and thereby helped to identify the technologies that would need to be developed in order for fusion to be commercially successful. During 1973, a team of U.S. scientists prepared a document to summarize what we knew about tokamaks in those days, because tokamaks were relatively new on the U.S. scene. They've been invented in Russia. We were working on stellarators and lots of other things. And our people were among many Westerners who just didn't want to believe that tokamaks could possibly be better than the things that we were working on. But nevertheless, we laid out all of this in a document called WASH 1295 that laid out the basic U.S. strategy for developing the tokamak concept. And during 75, 76, a more comprehensive plan was developed, IRTA 7610. By then, AEC had become Energy Research and Development Administration. And Bob is acknowledged in this document as having contributed to the development of that plan. And this is one of the graphs from that plan. And basically it said that if you wanted to get to fusion, it depended somewhat on how much money you get as to how fast you would get there. And so we laid out several scenarios to get from the mid-70s out to something around the year 2000. I note that we had one logic that said, well, what if we don't get any more money? You can see that there's an asymptote here, that with no more money, you don't ever get there, because you can't get there from here to there without doing some new things that are going to cost a bit of money. I'll come back to this later. I noticed on Jerry Kulcinski's slide that there was a fellow listed who was a PhD student of Bob's named Al Mency. Al Mency went to the Congress and became a key staff person for Congressman Mike McCormick. Mike McCormick took on the challenge of fusion energy policy in the late 70s, and he formed an advisory committee to the House Science and Technology Committee, and Bob was a member of that committee. By then, he had just moved to UCLA. And Bob also at that time was simultaneously serving on the Department of Energy's Energy Research Advisory Board, and they had a review committee which was chaired by John Foster of TRW. And these studies became very important, as you will see. But I must say, now that I realize that Al Mency was one of your students, Al Mency was extremely instrumental, as congressional staff people always are, doing all of the work, or most of the work, to get everybody else on board and all the other congressional offices and working with the Senate and so on. And Al was an incredible asset to us in those days. Now, both of these committees that Bob served on, they stated that fusion was ready for engineering development, and they recommended that a fusion engineering test reactor be built during the 1980s. And our whole game plan at that point was built around moving forward from the tokamak fusion test reactor, which we had started to build in the 70s at Princeton, to an engineering phase of the program in which an engineering test reactor followed by a demonstration power plant such as the UMACs were on a reasonably quick schedule. The result of these reviews and Representative McCormick's efforts was overwhelming congressional approval of the Magnetic Fusion Energy Engineering Act of 1980 that was signed by President Carter on October 7th, 1980. It called for the construction of a fusion engineering test reactor during the 1980s and the operation of a fusion demonstration power plant by the year 2000. And this was a broad acceptance of the game plan that we laid out in the 76 document to get there from here to there. And Mike McCormick used to call this his 20-year, $20 billion program. But $20 billion was not to be forgotten, that you don't get there in 20 years without that $20 billion. Here's a photograph of Mike McCormick's Fusion Energy Advisory Committee. You'll recognize the guy right here with the mustache. I think Jerry already showed some photographs of Bob's famous mustache, which in some of his ones was quite big and bushy, and then it got kind of a little bit more refined. You may recognize some of the other people in this photo. Here's Ken Fowler, who was head of the program at Livermore. This is Ursula Evans, who was the vice president of Westinghouse. There's Chihiro Okawa. Joe Gavin, who was the head of Grumman Aerospace. John Landis, who used to be the president of General Atomics in the 60s, but at this point he was executive vice president of Stone & Webster Engineering Company. This is the president of Boeing Corporation. Al Trivelpiece, whom many of you know. I might mention this guy in the back here in the audience is Locke Bogart. I'm in contact with Locke. He's retired now down near Tampa, and he saw that this was happening. He's not well, so he wasn't able to come out, but he asked me to send you his congratulations and his admiration for all the work that you've done, because Locke was very much instrumental during the 70s in the office of pushing the engineering and technology portions of the program. Over here in this corner is Paul Reardon, who was the project manager for the construction of tokamak fusion test reactor. And for the record, I've listed everybody that was in this photographs. There were a few people that were on the committee that aren't shown in the photograph, probably because of the angle of the photograph. Bob Hirsch was actually the chairman of this committee. Dick Balsizer, who was the president of EPRI, was on that committee, as was Harold Firth from Princeton. Fusion Power Associates, we formed it in 1979 with help from SAIC, a La Jolla company here. Al Trivelpiece and Nick Kroll were VPs there at the time. And we've been having annual meetings now for the last 34 years. And Bob frequently spoke at our meetings during the 1980s and 1990s. And this is a photograph of Bob speaking at one of our early annual meetings. Now, during the 1980s, Bob was a member of DOE's Magnetic Fusion Advisory Committee. It was called MFAC. It was chaired by Ron Davidson as the first chair, followed by Fred Reby in 1985. Fred is also retired and living in Santa Fe, and when he saw this was happening, he emailed me and asked me to also send you his regards and congratulations. And I think he's probably also slightly older than you. But back in those days, Fred was one of the youngest looking people that was a senior manager in the program. We used to call him the Boy Scout. I don't have a picture of him to prove that. Now, in early 1988, DOE initiated an effort to prepare conceptual designs of possible fusion power plants under Bob's direction at UCSD. This began the very fruitful effort at UCSD, which included the ARES studies that has continued under the direction of Farrokh Najmabadi since Bob's departure. And as a part of these studies, I want to mention this here, is that Bob actually formed a utility advisory committee for this effort to provide guidance from fusion's ultimate customer, the electric power industry. And I mention it here because the fusion community is not famous for having good relations or with its customers. It doesn't talk to its customers, the electric power industry, very often. It doesn't take a lot of advice from them on how to run its program. And so I want to congratulate Bob on making sure that the electric utility people at least had the opportunity to provide some guidance to the effort.
Steve, that was still at UCLA.
You were still at UCLA when you had this?
That happened, came down here in '93, so I want to give UCLA the credit.
Okay, sorry about that. Speaking at our annual meeting in 1989, Bob said this, talking about his efforts. Our program is focused on developing visions of fusion reactors. These visions are guided by our long-term objective to achieve safe and environmentally attractive fusion power. They lay out our challenges in physics and technology as a guide to the national program development. And if we can meet these challenges, fusion will find its place as part of the energy mix. This picks up on Jerry's theme that I've always been very thankful for, that the program being almost completely a plasma physics program in reality very much needed these long-range visions that came out of these types of studies. In 1990, in late 80s, let me just say that fusion is always going through some crisis or another. In the late 80s, we had put into the budget something called the Compact Ignition Tokamak, which was one of the stepping stones facilities that we wanted to build in our early planning. And we had lost that program. It had gone into the budget and been pulled out of the budget, and I haven't got time to go into why. But the result of it all was that in 1990, Energy Secretary Watkins decided he had to have a whole new review. And he established what was called the Fusion Policy Advisory Committee, FPAC, under the chairmanship of former presidential science advisor H. Guyford Stever, and Bob served on that committee. If you're getting a little theme here, every time there was an important advisory committee, Bob got tapped to be on these committees. This committee advised that fusion must become energy-oriented, with specific goals of operating a fusion power demonstration plant by 2025. Notice this is already a slip of 25 years from what we had hoped to do, and as a result of the fact we didn't get the money that we wanted or build the facilities we wanted to build in the 80s. They also advised, and this was one of the first times where inertial fusion really got taken seriously in our roadmaps, that both magnetic fusion and inertial fusion should be supported with the aim of achieving that goal. In 1991, based on this study, Ann Davies, who was the director of the DOE Office of Fusion Energy, she established a new advisory committee called the Fusion Energy Advisory Committee, FEAC, to replace the MFAC, and she named Bob as chair. I had the privilege of serving on FEAC for several years under Bob's leadership. Ann very much wanted to be here. She was planning to come. She wound up, she's always falling off her horse. She's a horsewoman, and she's always having broken bones and so on. And so she had to have an operation on her toe, and her doctor told her she couldn't travel, and so she couldn't come here. But she did send a letter, and I'm going to read it at the end, and I'm going to present you this signed letter from Ann Davies. She brought it over to my office a couple of days ago. So she's very sorry she can't be here. I just list these for the record. This is the members of FEAC in 1991. I'd like to call your attention especially the fact John Holdren was a member of this FEAC, and as probably you all know, he is now President Obama's science advisor and has been since President Obama took office. Here's Bob without the mustache. In 1992, Fusion Power Associates presented its leadership awards to Bob and to Jerry, quote, in recognition of their outstanding leadership qualities and their pioneering and continuing contributions to the vision of the future fusion reactor designs, which provide essential guidance to all fusion research and development. Going on, and I'm getting towards the end of the time period that I'm going to talk about, which is the end of the 1990s. In 1995, you served on another committee. This one of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, PCAST. John Holdren by then was on the PCAST, and he carried out a fusion review, and tapped Bob to be on this review. And this was 95, 96 was when we were under another budget threat and big cuts were going on in Washington. And the next two things that I'm talking about here in 95 all had to do with seeing if there was some way we could keep these cuts from really destroying the entire program. This report urged a strategy for maintaining a strong domestic core program in plasma science and technology, a collaboratively funded international fusion experiment at a cost of about 1/3 of ITER as then currently planned, and an international program to develop practical low activation fusion reactor materials. And in March of 95, at a hearing of the House Appropriations Committee, Bob said in part, "Short of building new machines, it is hard to show you more dramatic results than what the program recently produced," referring to TFTR, which had produced 10 megawatts of fusion power. He said, "We are ready now to start construction on a new U.S. tokamak, which will enable further optimization of fusion power plant design." Unfortunately, the Congress then slashed the fusion budget, called for a restructuring of the U.S. fusion program with virtually no hope offered to us by the Congress for any new major facilities. This was kind of a turning point for the fusion program looking back, where we sort of were told, you guys, we're not going to develop fusion in the U.S. on our own. And you're not going to get money to build these big new machines that you would like. And if you want to get on with the job and still have fusion at any time, you better start working with the international community. And the result of all that, as you'll hear later, I'm not going to talk about ITER, but ITER is in fact that engineering test reactor that we wanted to build in the 80s, we wanted to build in the 90s. And it's a long time in coming, but in fact, it turned out the only way you ever got to do it, or we are getting to do it, is by joining up with other countries. And while the U.S. program has not prospered since this time, other countries like Korea and China are really rising rapidly. Japan is strong, Europe is strong, and we're a part of the international program, even though we're perhaps not the big leaders that we thought we would be as our own individual program. I'm not going to bemoan what happened to us the rest of the 90s. We lost the TFTR as a result of these budget cuts. We shut down our only major tritium burning experiment. The Europeans with JET still have theirs running. We were told to withdraw from the ITER in the late 1990s. It took us until 2003 to figure out a way to politically get back into it, and so on. So in 1995, Martha Krebs, who was the director of the DOE Office of Science, she asked Bob, as chairman of FIAC, to set up a process to guide this restructuring that was ordered by Congress. And in a response letter, June 27th, 96, Bob told her, the program should have a new mission statement to advance plasma science, and fusion technology, which constitute the knowledge base needed for an economically and environmentally attractive fusion energy source. This has remained the fusion program's marching order since that time. I was no longer a member of FIAC when these restructuring events took place, but looking back, this, in fact, was a change in the program's goal from developing a fusion power plant to developing the knowledge base for a fusion power plant. Martha Krebs adopted these recommendations, and then she also not only restructured the program, she restructured the FIAC, and she renamed it the Fusion Energy Sciences Advisory Committee, and with a new chair, John Sheffield of Oak Ridge National Laboratory. This is about all I'm going to say about Bob's association with the magnetic fusion program. Bob, most of us really know Bob mostly for his activities with the magnetic fusion program, but in fact, Bob was also active with the inertial fusion people. And I've found one photograph of a visit that a bunch of us took to Lawrence Livermore Lab. This is in the lobby of their laser building, and here's Bob on the end. I haven't been able to find out exactly what this particular occasion was, but these are mostly inertial fusion people. And next to Bob here is George Miller. George was the associate director for weapons at the laboratory at that time, and he eventually then became the director of the laboratory. There's Ron Davidson, who most people know was the chairman of MFAC and is on just about everybody's advisory committee, as Bob always was. Tim Coffey, who was director of the Naval Research Laboratories program, Conrad Longmire, who's a noted weapons scientist and who was a pioneer in the early days of the fusion program. I don't know who this guy is, but this is Bob Sproul, the president of the University of Rochester, and here's a very special person who's unfortunately no longer with us, Marshall Rosenbluth. Marshall spent many, many years here at UCSD in his distinguished career. We often called him the Pope of plasma physics. And Marshall was a very special person, and if Marshall could have done one thing, I think, extra in his life that he would like to have lived for would have been to have been here today and had a chance to speak at this particular event. Here on the end is Dave Hammer from Cornell University, and as I did the last time, I've listed for the record all the people that are in that photograph. Well, just to come back for a minute, here's one of the logics from that early slide, when it shows the machines that we wanted to build. The ignition test reactor, which went by various names when we tried to put it in the budget, like CIT. Here's the engineering test reactor, which really is ITER. So we are on some sort of a path, but we're on a much longer track here. Here's the committee that Bob was on, the Fusion Policy Advisory Committee. You can see they tried to get us back on a growth curve, but you can also see that it didn't work. There was a Secretary of Energy Advisory Board that tried a more modest attempt to get us on a growth curve. I don't think Bob was on that committee. And here's the Holdren Committee that Bob was on. Now, this committee actually said fusion deserves and is ready to have a much bigger budget and to build these machines, they said, but we recognize that the budgets are all being cut in 95, 96, and therefore they said, at least you guys keep the program level. Don't cut it any further. You see that the Congress didn't buy that. And here's another chart that goes out to the present day. You can see here's what the actual funding is in constant dollars. It's actually below the flat curve I mentioned earlier. So when is fusion going to happen? I don't honestly know. I can tell you that the U.S. has no timetable for fusion. But the Europeans have a timetable. They have a roadmap. The Koreans have a roadmap and a timetable. The Chinese have a roadmap and a timetable. So there are timetables and roadmaps out there, and we are participating in this. And I guess some of us still are hoping for better days. I've recently published a book, in case some of you haven't heard about it. It's called Search for the Ultimate Energy Source, A History of the U.S. Fusion Energy Program, which starts back in the 50s and takes you right up to the Obama administration and treats a lot of the things I've talked about in much greater detail than I am doing here. And I'm going to give Bob a copy of this, and I've inscribed it to him, to Bob Conn, in recognition and appreciation of your numerous important contributions to the fusion effort over many decades, signed by the author. Finally, I don't know if I've overstepped my time. Well, this is my summary slide, but I want to say that throughout the decades Bob spent in fusion, he provided both technical vision and advisory leadership. Unfortunately, the budget and policy decisions in Washington have prevented his vision from becoming a reality on the timescale many of us have had hoped. On the other hand, we remain hopeful that fusion power will eventually come to fruition, based in part on his legacy, for which all of us are very appreciative. I mentioned that Ann Davies couldn't be here. She gave me a letter. I'm going to read it. From Ann to Dear Bob, happy birthday. Congratulations on reaching this milestone. This means I'm actually a few months older than you. That surprises me because when I first came to the fusion program, you were already an established participant in the program, and you always seemed older and wiser than I. In 1974, the reactor studies that you were conducting at the University of Wisconsin were already having a major influence on the program. I realized early on that you and your colleagues were providing the headlights for the program, helping us understand important physics and technology issues that needed to be addressed in the research program if we were ever going to have fusion power. For example, one of the issues was how to fuel a tokamak reactor. We developed pellet injectors to prove it could be done, and then those injectors became vital tools, not only for fueling, but also for diagnosing fusion plasma as an unexpected benefit. Of course, the reactor studies also opened the door to dialogue with utilities about the future applications of fusions. And once you were at UCSD, she maybe made this mistake too, you convened our utility advisory panel to expand this dialogue. Another issue for the tokamak concept was the ratio of plasma pressure to magnetic field, and you showed how important it was to configure magnetic fields to confine higher plasma pressure, and this insight led to non-circular shape of virtually every other tokamak today. Your leadership extended to every aspect of the program. Your success at establishing fusion institutes at both Wisconsin and UCLA raised the visibility of fusion at these universities, and therefore nationally and internationally. It was natural that we ask you to serve on review and advisory committees to help guide the program. In particular, after two successive major reductions in program funding in 1995 and 1996, I fully expected that the program would implode, that our program leaders would circle the wagons and shoot in. It was clear that we were going to have to undertake major restructuring of the fusion program, but how? Following our tried and true tradition, we asked our Fusion Energy Advisory Committee to undertake a study and recommend how to deal with the situation. You were the chair of FIAC, and I depended heavily on your judgment and wisdom to lead the community through this process, and that you did. Then you took the report, called on senior DOE officials, testified before Congress. The community regrouped, the budget stabilized, and we focused on plasma science and the science and technology of fusion. Eventually, we made our way back into the ITER project, from which Congress had pulled us in 1998. Throughout this turbulent time, you were an absolute rock of support for the fusion program. As you served as Dean of Engineering at UCSD and established new departments and ran a small business and did all the things that are recounted in your bio, you were always willing to serve the program in any capacity. The fusion program owes you an enormous debt. With affection and gratitude, Ann Davies, May 9th, 2013, and I second that motion. Thank you.
Abdou is on the faculty at UCLA, a distinguished professor in the engineering department there. Mohamed, I'd like to invite you to come up. I think they've queued your slides.
Yeah,
Is that them?
Can he go ahead and show the first slide?
There we are. Very good.
Okay. All right. Well, good afternoon. Happy birthday, Bob. It is with great pleasure that I participate in the 70th birthday celebration for Robert Conn. Starting more than 40 years ago, Bob has made pioneering, seminal, major, and outstanding contributions to fusion energy research. System studies. He founded and led major research institutions that have played a significant role in advancing fusion. Bob was a major force in shaping the U.S. fusion program policy and influencing the direction of the world program. I have known Bob for 4 decades. Almost all my professional life. I worked with him as a student, as a colleague, and as a collaborator. So I know firsthand the enormous contributions that Bob has made to fusion. I also got to know Bob very well as a friend. And I appreciated very much his wonderful qualities as superhuman being, who's a pleasure to work with and who had the interests of others high on his agenda. I'll try now to take you through a very quick journey through history to highlight just some examples of Bob's major contributions and along the way recall a few things that illustrate how wonderful a human being Bob has been. The first time I ever saw Bob was in 1970. I was a new graduate student at the University of Wisconsin who just arrived from Egypt. And I went to attend a seminar that we were told would be given by a candidate for a faculty position. Bob walked in, a handsome fellow with this Italian man bag, I still remember it, but with long hair, something like a hippie look, which was unfamiliar to me at this time. If you noticed in Jerry's first slide, I was a first-year student. I was in a suit and a tie, but Bob was in his casual and look. So I started wondering if this guy knew anything about science. But Bob gave an excellent seminar. Actually, I remember it included part on neutron slowing down. Fortunately for University of Wisconsin, Bob joined the UW nuclear faculty. At that time, I was starting to develop neutronics, methods for fusion, including neutron transport, tritium breeding, and nuclear heating, and to explore designs for blank and chill. One day, Bob came to my modest graduate student office and told me about his interest in neutronics. We had very good discussion, and I was impressed both by his intellect and his approach as a professor interacting with a student. Since then, we became good friends, and we collaborated on a number of things. Actually, I published one of my first journal papers with Bob, even though he was not my academic advisor. Oh, how do I get the next slide? Next slide, please. Just to put a smile on Bob's face and remind him of the good old times. This paper was in 74 Nuclear Science and Engineering, which was the most prestigious journal at that time, and it was a comparative study of several fusion reactor design blankets. A very important part of fusion history, to which Bob Conn was one of the principal leaders and contributors, is the series of reactor studies carried out at the University of Wisconsin in the 70s. These early studies of UMAC 1, 2, 3, and UMAC that Jerry Kulcinski talked about were truly pioneering studies. It was the first examination of fusion reactor issues and the first comprehensive vision of what a fusion reactor might look like. As I reflect back on these studies, I find they were visionary and comprehensive. 2 years ago, I had to go back and look at these studies to prepare for a JSON review of the fusion program in the area of tritium and the blankets. And although I was personally one of the principals of these studies, I was amazed to observe again how fast a pace advances were made in fusion technology in the 70s. To illustrate this point, can I have the next slide, please? Arrow keys. Okay. This. Oh, okay, all right.
People can hear it offline.
All right, okay, good. So to illustrate this point, let me show 2 slides from my presentation to Jason. I didn't make these for this occasion. I just picked up from this present made in 2011. Okay. So I was reviewing 40 years. There was an external committee questioning at this time, after 40 years, whether we can breathe, what the blanket is, and so forth. And it's good. I showed them the stuff because, frankly, the stuff they were talking about, some of it I did personally as a graduate student. I was done in Wisconsin. So I showed the history here, and there were many slides. I'll just show two. The importance of the blanket was recognized from day one of the first fusion reactor study in the early 70s. UMAC-1 at the University of Wisconsin. UMAC-1, which was carried out in the period 71 to 73, selected self-cooled liquid lithium with the stainless steel at the simplest concept. The key points from the study on the blanket: lithium at natural enrichment can breed well with no neutron multiplier. Tritium can be recovered with acceptable tritium inventory. Lithium can be circulated on the outboard of the reactor, but not on the inboard because of MHD effects. Insulating coating should be used to minimize MHD issues. In 1974, Vic Maroney at Argonne demonstrated that tritium can be extracted from liquid lithium using a molten salt process with the potential to keep tritium inventory lithium. When you look here, you really get impressed. In the span of 3 years, we showed that we can breed, we can handle tritium, and we can extract the tritium, and we showed that there is an attractive blanket design using liquid metals. Okay. Then in the period 73-75, UMAC-2 introduced ceramic breeders as possibly attractive option for non-mobile blanket with low lithium and the tritium inventories. The key points here were batch processing of tritium as commonly done in fission reactors not acceptable. At that time, we were told, why don't you do it as fission? And we said, well, you can do it because of the larger tritium inventory. Fusion is different from fission. In situ tritium recovery is necessary. A scheme of flowing low-pressure helium gas in the ceramic breeder was introduced. This is the same scheme being used today, and by the way, it didn't just fall from the sky. We had to work on this. Actually, the first system before this had vacuum. The whole blanket was in vacuum, and the tritium gets sucked and so forth. But, okay, neutron multiplier is required for adequate tritium breeding, which is still the case. Beryllium was used. The issue of limited beryllium reserves was raised, and still steel is not adequate as a structural material. So when you look at it, so we took the liquid metal, we can breed, we can extract. Then by 75, we showed also the second class of blanket concepts using solid breeders. And until today, the two major classes of blanket concepts are liquid metals and ceramic breeders, and we will never be able to decide between these two until we test them in the fusion environment. UMAC-3 in 75 proposed the liquid lithium for the outboard, ceramic breeder for the inboard to eliminate the MHD, and TZM structure to obtain high temperature. The key point from that study was refractory materials are expensive. High thermal efficiency cannot offset the cost of piping. And although TZM is not suitable for current strategy of flow activation, the conclusion was shown later to be applicable to all refractory alloys. Then, okay, we introduced the ceramic breeder class in 79. The trio experiment was carried out by Argonne in the high-fission reactor at Oak Ridge and demonstrated the feasibility of in situ tritium release using low-pressure helium gas in the ceramic breeder. So we really did all the feasibility issues, at least, in these early days. Now, a major conclusion in the University of Wisconsin studies, which I highlight, this is not a technical thing, I'm going to get off the technical very quickly, But because it gets forgotten, there was a very major conclusion in the early UW study that the vacuum vessel must be outside the blanket. You cannot have it at the first wall. We tried this in UMAC 1. We found out it doesn't work. You have to put it outside. This was and remains one of the most consequential decisions ever made in reactor studies, and frankly, it has enormous impact on reliability, availability, maintainability, and inspectability, and represent the most serious challenge to fusion environment. And unless we build a fusion facility like FNSF or whatever, this can have major implication, okay? Maybe tokamaks or toroidal geometries are never going to make it unless we find out if we can deal with this issue. The point here, I hope these two slides give you a sense of how fast the progress was made on fusion reactor studies and the fusion technology in the 70s. Actually, the progress was so fast-paced that Bob Conn wrote a pioneering paper in 1976, which is shown here. Let me see if I can get it. This paper, I remember it because I remember Bob standing there telling, we had a workshop in Madison, Wisconsin. The world leader came in, and Bob was starting there, admired by everybody. The world was listening to Bob of how to make a fusion reactor attractive. I was looking for the paper, I remember, and I went to the UW. I Googled just UW FDM, and here all the FDM. So Jerry, I really want to thank you very much for making sure that this important part of fusion literature is preserved. This paper was presented by Bob later in the American Nuclear Society topical meeting, but he gave it in a workshop in Madison. The title of the paper was, What is Past is Prologue, Future Directions in Tokamak Power Reactor Design Research, September 76. And let me just to tell you what Bob was talking about, just show you the abstract. So, okay. So, what is past is prologue, future direction to Tokamak Power Reactor Design Research. We learn from our past endeavors, conceptual Tokamak Power Reactor designs over the last 5 years have provided us with many fundamental insights regarding tokamaks as fusion reactors. This first generation of studies has helped lay the groundwork upon which to build improvements, reactor design, and begin a process of optimization. This was 1976. After reviewing the first generation of studies and the primary conclusion they produced, we discussed 4 current designs that are representative of present trends in this area of research. In particular, we discussed the trends toward the reduced reactor size and the higher neutron world loading is still an issue that we are dealing with today. Moving in this direction requires new approaches to many subsystem designs. It goes on, they just to give you illustration how quick Bob connected things together, presented, communicated to others, and influenced both the technical and the programmatic direction of fusion. In 1980, Bob moved to UCLA and started a strong fusion program that made substantial contributions to advancing fusion. He built his own strong group of researchers and students. He also developed strong collaborations with other faculties. Bob's program was so successful that one of our UCLA faculty described Bob as the man with the golden hand. Anything Bob touches becomes a gold. Let me pause here to note that Bob had a direct and a major influence in recruiting me to join the UCLA faculty in 1983. Bob believed in strengthening not only his group, but in helping the organizations he worked for become stronger and more successful. Bob's program at UCLA focused on plasma engineering and plasma wall interactions. I witnessed firsthand how Bob conceived and worked hard to build the PISCES facility, which contributed to our understanding of the PMI issues. Bob developed a vision for PISCES and convinced TRW, UCLA management, and DOE to all support and contribute to the PISCES program. PISCES is an example of how Bob did things. Bob never settled for small things. He always combined his scientific vision and the human interactions as well as leadership skills to build the large and excellent programs that played key roles in advancing fusion. I know that Farrokh will talk about reactor studies at UCLA and ARES, so I'll leave this part to Farrokh, but let me mention how it started. I recall sometime in the mid-'80s, Bob and I were attending a community retreat organized by John Clark, the head of OFES at the time. Bob listened to the difficult problems being discussed, and he whispered to me, Mohamed, you know, we can get much better understanding of these issues and think of new solutions by starting a new generation of reactor studies. I nodded my head approvingly. Then I said, but Bob, do you really want to spend the effort it takes to start such reactor system studies again? I recall Bob looking at me and saying with great enthusiasm, Mohamed, I feel a strong pulse of energy. And I want to utilize it to do something exciting. Bob talked about this idea to John Clark, who immediately agreed, and this is how ARES got started. At UCLA, I had my own programs on fusion technology, but I got a lot of support and encouragement from Bob Conn. Let me just mention one quick example. I started a study called the Finesse as soon as I got to UCLA in 1983. But I had difficulties dealing with the bureaucracy of the university. Dewey insisted I get all the money and run the subcontracts to industry myself. But UCLA wanted to charge overhead on these subcontracts, which I thought would be too much. I talked to Bob. I told you, he has the magic touch. He had his magic solution. He asked me to go with him. We went to the chancellor, and he actually convinced the chancellor to waive all overhead and all the Finesse subcontract. This helped me get Finesse started. Finesse was a pioneering study to which Bob also made significant technical contribution. And just to quickly remind you, this was between 83 and 86. Some of the people who actually participated in the study are here. This study identified and characterized the issues, requirements for experiments and non-fusion and diffusion facilities for all fusion nuclear science, technology, components, and discipline. The study involved experts from the aerospace and the fission industries, experts in technology development, and the stronger participation by Japan and the EU. The study showed that an extensive R&D program is required for blanket FNST development and showed what this program is. That's what the key thing, including new facilities for multiple effect experiments and a dedicated DT fusion facility for integrated testing in the fusion and nuclear environment. The results of FNS were utilized by the world programs to plan their R&D program. If you really go to Japan, Europe, even what we did in the US, all the stuff actually was utilized, and there are many people in the room that made major contribution here. A direct outcome FNS was the definition of what we call the volumetric neutron source, and now we call it fusion nuclear facility, which many of the world programs are now plan to build the parallel to ITER. I hope it gets built. I always argued that it should be built even before ITER, so now at least we should do it parallel to ITER. If we don't do this and you just wait until ITER is done, it's not going to happen. So I know time is running out here, so I'll just conclude by congratulating Bob Conn on his 70th birthday and his many decades of outstanding achievement. Bob, we love you and we admire you. Best wishes for many more decades of health, happiness, and continued success. Thank you.
Who is on the faculty here at UC San Diego. Farrokh has worked with Bob and others on reactor system studies at the UCLA days and has continued that work until this day. So Farrokh, thank you.
So Bob, before I say my thing, I got an email from Frank Chen, and he sent me something to read for you, so let me start with that. For the people who may not know, Frank is a pioneer in plasma physics. He was a professor of electrical engineering at UCLA. People who have gone through plasma physics probably started, the first book they started was Frank Chen's Introduction to Plasma Physics. And the picture in the back is exactly the same picture that I saw when I was reading that book. So it's now in 6th or 7th edition. So Frank sent this from overseas. He can't be here. So Frank says, although Bob's accomplishments as dean at UCSD are indeed impressive, let's not forget what he did at UCLA before that. I, meaning Frank, was one of those who weaned Bob from Wisconsin and brought him to the West Coast. I had wanted to establish a large research laboratory like the one on the hill in Berkeley at UCLA. And Bob did a great job under the constraints that we had here. He established the Institute of Plasma Fusion Research at UCLA, IPFR, uniting all the groups in this field at UCLA. He secured funding, hired administrators who produced impressive annual reports. He further developed the modeling of fusion reactors with Farrokh Najmabadi, who has since dominated the field. They established the PISCES program to do fusion technology experiments, which were rare in those days. Student George Tynan, now Professor Tynan at UCSD, still has a PISCES machine in his greatly expanded program at UCSD. Bob also recruited Mohamed Abdou and Nas Ghunim to UCLA. On the national level, Bob was in constant contact with the OFE and was an important advisor to it. It's typical Frank's writing, you know that. When I came back, yeah, exactly. I mean, you understand Bob is coming from heart, you know that. When I came back from Australia with news about Helicon discharges, Bob was the only one who saw the possibilities. With the student Greg Campbell, he formed the company Plasma Material Technologies, which produced the Helicon semiconductor etcher Emory. And this was heartily accepted by industry, was even made into a cluster tool that passed marathon tests. Unfortunately, PMT was too small to provide worldwide support for Intel and so on, and so it was merged by a much bigger company later. So Bob left a considerable trail of accomplishment before he became dean at UCSD. And Frank's message is, happy birthday, young man. It has been a pleasure to know you and work with you. Okay, so, sure. So I started my postdoc work with Bob. I graduated and went work for him. And while people have talked about his contribution to fusion science and the field as a whole, I would like actually to take a different route. And rather than institution, talk about how Bob has touched my life and other postdocs he had. So it's a personal thing. Maybe it's not as large to audience, but it has been very great to me. So I have to first start with a story about how I met Bob. He came to UC Berkeley and gave a seminar when I was a graduate student. And I can even envision right now the room we had the seminar. Of course, this guy had stash in here and so on. And I clearly recall that after his seminar, I got up and started asking questions. I told him I don't agree with some of the stuff he has done. Do you remember that, right? We have to talk about it. Yeah. So a lot of people afterwards came and told me, you're naive, why are you doing this? So anyway, but moving forward, a year after that, I was graduating from Berkeley, looking for jobs, and I had a job offer from TRW in Los Angeles. And just a week before I was supposed to fly down and sign the paperwork for my job, the contract, my recruiter at TRW called me up and said, our budget has been cut. Sorry, we can't hire you. And feeling a little bit attached to me because he had been recruiting me, he said, have you talked with this guy, Bob Conn at UCLA? And then he gave me a very long story about how exciting the UCLA program is. You can imagine at that time I was worried that Bob would basically remember me and tell me go away. So that made me to actually go to Bob at the APS meeting, Division of Plasma Physics meeting in New York in November of 1981. And so I went to him and introduced myself. Of course, I was a graduate student. I waited until he was alone by himself, standing somewhere. I said and introduced myself. The first thing was, he said to me that, I remember you from Berkeley. And of course, you think what I thought to myself. Holy. Okay. And basically, the possibility of position is completely gone. But what was amazing is that Bob kind of felt that without me my saying it. And he said that he actually enjoys people asking tough questions or disagreeing with him. We talked for some time. And then he told me to come for an interview down to Los Angeles. I went back to the hotel, and I told my girlfriend, who is now my wife, that I was going to go work at UCLA. And I want to say this, I actually interviewed him 2 weeks later and then started working 2 months later. But the reason I tell you this story is how Bob has been effective in communicating and encouraging people, even a lowly graduate student. So it's still in my mind. I can see you, Bob, standing there at hotel in New York, and I went and talked with you. So I worked at UCLA. My work was amazing because it was very different. Most postdocs, when they go start with their faculty, they give a specific projects to work on, and they become actually more specialized in their scientific discipline. This is really a science work. You want to hone your science studies. But Bob's approach was totally different. While I was working on a specific research project, he encouraged me and other postdocs to spend a good portion of our time to develop new ideas and research topics. And to me, it was foreign that somebody says, you have 25% of your time, look at new ideas. More importantly, he was mentoring us to be a good scientist beyond being a good technical person. And there is a lot more than being a good scientist than that. For example, through interaction with him, I learned how to think about and justify and plan my research projects in the context of a broader goal of moving the field forward, to use a metaphor, not to focus on the tree, but consider the forest. And what is amazing that he wouldn't tell you this. You go talk with him, and you come out, and the message was heard and understood. So in 1986, we started the Tynan project, which was a study of reverse field pinch as a power plant. This study partnered four scientists from 4 institutions. The study was successful, and as a result, John Clark asked Bob to basically put together a national team, a much larger national team to study fusion power plant called the ARIES program, which has continued to today with major impact on the direction of national and international research. I was fortunate enough to work with Bob for this project, the Tynan, and then through ARIES, and then take over the studies after Bob became Dean of the School of Engineering at UCSD. The one thing that I took from the first 2 years of this activity was the reason the program was a success was Bob. He had the ability, he has the ability to nurture a team culture among a group of people with different background and different interests to achieve a common goal. Something that if you had told them before they started, they wouldn't believe they would accept that and do it. So this has been really an important thing. And that's a great lesson that I learned, and I've tried to apply to that. This unique ability Bob brought with him to UC San Diego School of Engineering, the feeling of empowerment and belonging. While we can use metrics as national ranking, student body, graduation rate, research dollars to judge how much the School of Engineering grew when Bob was our dean, there is something that cannot be measured, but it was in the air, and that's the feeling of excitement and belonging. More importantly, everybody was saying, this is the place I want to be. And this is not from the faculty here. I heard this from so many faculties from other universities. We had great success to recruit, and to a large degree was because of the atmosphere that Bob generated here. Another example that I can also how Bob approached a bigger problem with this feeling of empowerment. As mentioned, in 1995-96, there was a huge budget cut at the federal level. Fusion program was cut by $150 million. Moreover, we were told that next year you lose another $100 million. And Bob was in chair of FIAC, and they were trying to restructure the program. And Bob did something which I'd never seen done in any other program, and that is that he formed a scientific advisory committee to report to him. And he said that everybody in SciComm should be young, quote unquote. The age range in that committee was 38, 37 to 42. I see one of our people, Jerry Nabbertil, sitting back there, just waving at that. It was amazing. I have been to many panels, and I feel SciComm was the most important tool in restructuring the program. You basically gave the role of deciding the future to the people who the future belonged to. And so I want to tell you about that. I think a lot of people, a lot of us who were in that committee still think about it and talk about it. So anyway, I just wanted to relay some of my feelings about this. And so I would just like to summarize to you that, Bob, as one of your postdocs, I want to thank you for mentoring me and others like me. You have touched our lives in many ways. So thank you and congratulations.
To make his way forward, Charlie is the former director of the fusion program at Argonne National Lab in Oak Ridge, and also worked with Bob Conn here at San Diego in the
as a new member of the nuclear engineering faculty, and I was working on and trying to finish my PhD research thesis. You might conclude from that he's older than I am, but in fact, when I got the note from George to come participate in this today, I just passed that milestone a month or so before. By the way, I would apologize to many of you who are not quite of that age that some of us are. If this seems like a little bit of a walk down memory lane, it's exactly so. Many of us here have spent maybe 4 decades devoted to fusion research, and it's been one hell of a ride. Farrokh, Mohamed, Jerry have talked about Bob's early career contributions to the UMAC studies, the ARI studies, and the like. I would like to just comment a little bit further on that. You need to go back when these studies were first started. The discipline of fusion systems analysis did not exist. It had to be invented. This work had never been done before. We did not really understand the challenge of developing fusion very well. Yes, we understood the issues, and we're beginning to understand them, what it took to confine a high-temperature plasma, but the rest of it was mysterious. This work laid the ground rule to build that comprehensive understanding. Perhaps we understand it a little too well today and are rather sobered by the challenge facing us. For example, the vital importance of advanced materials in the fusion nuclear systems that Mohamed mentioned were not appreciated at all. That early work laid that groundwork and, in fact, fed back to those early materials and nuclear technology programs and greatly influenced their direction. Even with regard to plasma physics, these system studies pointed out the advantages of different modes of operation of tokamaks and other systems, which you now see being looked at in a comprehensive way by our modern experimental facilities, such as D3D across the street. After Bob went to UCLA, as noted before, his research turned to a relatively new area, namely what happens when a very high temperature plasma comes in contact with the material world. Up until that time, not much was thought about this problem. The early experiments didn't have much of an issue here. They were fairly short pulsed, millisecond, maybe second or so. But people with the forethought to understand this recognized that this would be a crucial area. And so Bob led this activity to develop the idea of Pisces, which is a way to simulate in the laboratory the edge conditions of a large confinement experiment to get the right temperatures and right densities and to do it steady state, pushing the state of the art. Today, this is indeed a major research area, and in fact, with regard to the ITER project, it perhaps is its most challenging and troubling issue. I would expect that if ITER does fall short, I sure hope it doesn't, but if it does, it's probably some issue related to plasma wall interactions, disruptions, and all these kinds of problems. This work by Bob led to him receiving one of the highest personal awards that the Department of Energy can offer, the Ernest O. Lawrence Memorial Award, which he received in 1984. And not long after that, again, based on his pioneering work, he received perhaps the highest recognition that an engineer can receive, namely he was elected to the National Academy of Engineering in 1987. Now, besides doing state-of-the-art research, building academic programs, in his spare time he decided we need a journal developed to fusion engineering. And in fact, he pioneered and developed a new journal published by Elsevier, and that began in 1984. He served as the principal editor of the journal until 2001. He asked me to take over. I served in that role until just last year, and now our good friend and colleague Mohamed Abdou takes over as the job of principal editors. a 30-year-old journal. It's the leading journal in that field in the international area. And for the UC folks, I would note the job of leading the journal remains in the UC family. I want to pick up a little bit with Steve Dean's talk and carry it a little bit further on the crucial role Bob has played in developing the strategy and policy of the U.S. program. And I'm going to concentrate particularly on the implications of that work on ITER, which was rather profound. Steve outlined, in the 70s and 80s, most of our planning studies had the general view that we would develop an energy system, and we talked about demos in the year 2000, 2025, and the like. But by about 1990, it was becoming clear that we really were not going to receive the funding that would be required, as Steve so clearly pointed out in a number of his charts. Bob was asked to head a new advisory committee, the Fusion Energy Advisory Committee by Ann Davies in 1991. And the next year, they published a fusion program strategy. In that strategy, they identified the two highest priorities for the U.S. program. Number one, to continue with the tokamak fusion test reactor at Princeton, then our largest experiment, and carry out the DT experiments. And the number two was to participate in the engineering phase of ITER, which in 1992 was just getting underway. However, embedded in that report was an observation almost surely forgotten. The observation said that if we are to go on and build ITER, we will require substantial additional funds, and they will need to be separate and above the base program. This was 20 years ago that Bob's committee said this. Fast forward today. This is today our dilemma, which we have not solved. If that advice 20 years ago was paid more attention to, I think we'd be in a whole lot better shape today. A few years later, the President's Committee of Advisors in Science and Technology, known as PCAST, carried out a thorough review of the fusion program, as Steve noted before. They set up a fusion panel, chaired by John Holdren, and the vice chair was Bob. And as noted before, Holdren, of course, is now the President's Science Advisor. They reviewed what had been done before and said, it is a worthy goal to have an energy-directed program to build a demo plant, but let's be honest, we're not going to receive that amount of money. So what to do? The recommendations were, one, complete the experiments on TFTR, complete our contributions to the engineering phase of ITER, then about halfway done. However, what they said also is we in the U.S. should approach our ITER partners and ask to consider reducing the scope of ITER, its size, and its cost. At the same time, the U.S. is planning to build an advanced tokamak experiment, in those days called TBX, and they advised us to approach our foreign partners and see if they'd be interested in funding it. Unfortunately, the answer back on both of those was no. Now keep in mind, in 1995, through the leadership of John Holdren and Bob Conn, they identified the need to reduce the cost of ITER. I'll return to that in a little bit. The following year, Bob's committee undertook an entire rethinking of the U.S. fusion program. It came to be known as restructuring the program. And as noted before, the central idea was to make the principal approach to develop the science base and the understanding that it would be needed ultimately to develop fusion. A very necessary and realistic adjustment at the time, given the realities of the budget and where we stood. They also said we should complete this engineering phase of ITER, but said the question of building ITER should be left open. They also said that the U.S. needs to look at its role in the international program, and we will be thinking primarily as fundamentally a support role. This has been the cornerstone of the approach in the U.S. for 17 years, developed under that PCAST study by Bob and others. The following year, Bob undertook an effort to conduct a comprehensive review of the ITER design. This was a large effort, involved a whole bunch of people in the community, many, many panels, the most thorough technical review that we had done in the U.S. up until that point. My job at the time was heading the U.S. home team, so we were the people being reviewed. And by the way, I have a piece of advice. If you have a choice between being the reviewer and the reviewee, it's better to be the reviewer. It's a little more fun. But that panel carried out a solid review. It concluded that there was a sound engineering basis for ITER. There were difficult challenges, but no showstoppers. The physics was good enough to have confidence, at least as a mild energy gain, and with some additional risk ignition. It was a sound basis for us to enter into negotiations. That review at the time was the foundation of deciding how worthy it might be for us to proceed into ITER. And I don't think we have conducted quite a similar community-based technical review since those days. Now, let me just fast forward a little bit. The following year, in 1998, Congress saw fit to significantly reduce the budget, and by 1999, we were out of ITER and had to conclude our work. The principal concern of the Congress in those days was the cost of ITER. I can't help but look back and wonder if the advice of PCAS had been taken and we had moved back then to somewhat reduce the size and the cost, we would be in a fundamentally different position today. But, of course, hindsight is perfect. Too bad we were unable to do that. Finally, I want to come to just a brief story about how I came to UC San Diego to work for Bob. This illustrates this man's rather clever and unorthodox recruiting style. At the time, I was located at Oak Ridge, heading the U.S. project office, but the international headquarters for ITER was here in San Diego, back just up the road on Torrey Pines, across from the golf course. People like Tom Dillon and Maurice Sababa remember those days very well. And I was making a lot of trips. And we were meeting in Bob's office, I think it was January or so, 1994, getting ready for some meetings the following week with the international people. And we took a break. And Bob had just come to the campus here to assume his duties as dean, I think a few months before that. And we walked out of Bob's office, and there's a nice overlooking the engineering building. It's getting dark. I look across at this building, and the first thing I see in big neon lights is 4 letters, L-U-S-T. I said, wow. It turns out, I learned later, this was the Powell Structural Engineering Research Laboratory, and this was one of the campus's innovative artworks in which they flash on in big neon letters the 7 vices and the 7 virtues. I always wondered how Bob worked out the timing so critically to take that break, walk out there, in that instant, the word lust appears. So I turned to him and said, this must be a pretty interesting place to work. And he says, well, you ought to probably come here. And I said, you serious? And not too long after, I came here. I've always wondered if the first word that had appeared on that had been one of the 7 virtues. Probably would not have come. Happy birthday.
Know quite what led me to UCLA, but it was my good fortune to be there in the early 1980s and to become Bob's graduate student. And he had asked me to share a word or two about experience as a student, sort of represent my colleagues and I and our experience working with him. And as I was listening to some of the remarks here today, I was struck by a few qualities that Bob has shown repeatedly in his career, from his days at Wisconsin to Los Angeles to his work here as dean, and that is his strong ability to try to promote the people who are working with him, to seek their best interest, and to build a good team that can then carry out extraordinary things. And I remember I was trying to recall my time as a student and how those qualities were reflected in my interactions with him as an advisor. And I think the thing that comes to mind the most is his refusal to tell me what to work on. I started as a student in '84. He gave me the luxury of spending over 2 years taking courses full-time and supporting me financially to do that. Gave me the luxury to get a great physics and technology background. And then it came time to start experiments. I think I was the first student working in the Pisces group. I didn't know it at the time, frankly. I thought I was just one in a successor, but as I came to learn later, I was the guinea pig, that he had actually never done experiments before, and I was the first. And so we conceived of an experiment for a master's thesis and carried that out successfully. But then my interests, I was sharing with someone, I forget who it was earlier today, have always been in sort of fluid mechanics and turbulence and nonlinear physics and these sorts of things. And after finishing my master's work, I came to the conclusion, working with an extraordinarily talented postdoc named Brian LeBombard, who, by the way, gives his regards, Bob, came to the conclusion that I wanted to do something in plasma turbulence, because I had read in the fusion literature that this was an important piece of physics that determined the feasibility for magnetic fusion. So, and I knew it was a complicated problem. It would never be solved in my lifetime, and so therefore it seemed like a good topic to begin to do research in. And I remember for probably 6 months being worried about, gee, I want to pursue some experimental activity in this scientific area, but nobody is doing it in this group. There's no one. And wrestling with, talking with Brian, who was my day-to-day mentor at the time, about exactly what we should do. And finally, we came up with a concept of what we thought was an interesting thing to do for a thesis topic. And I carefully worked with Bob's secretary to schedule time to meet with him, and I sketched out we had view graphs in those days, plastic view graphs, and so I had 3 or 4 view graphs that sort of gave him the idea. But frankly, I had the meeting with trepidation, proposing this topic, and expecting to have to argue with him and twist his arm to talk him into letting me pursue this new track of research. And so he patiently heard me out and said, and at the end, I was sort of expecting some pushback and saying, well, but this is not really what our program is about, et cetera, et cetera. But to his credit, he said, sounds great, let's do it. And the meeting was over. And I sort of walked away, said, well, okay, what have I just gotten myself into? But it was his willingness to allow the people who work with him to pursue interests that they come up with and the problems that they define, and the freedom that he gave, at least me as a student, and I believe many others who worked with him, the freedom to pursue our interests within some reasonable boundaries, but nonetheless, the freedom to pursue our interests, I think is an extraordinary trait, and is one that characterizes Bob's leadership style. And so I've taken away from that experience the talk I have with all of my students as we're transitioning from taking courses to trying to define a research topic for their particular career. I tell them that the hardest, in my opinion, the hardest thing about this whole business of doing research is asking the right question, or maybe the right set of questions that are profound, interesting, relevant, and germane to the problems at hand. And I think if you look at the track and the arc of Bob's career that we've heard today about his work in fusion systems designs and plasma physics, if you come tomorrow, which I strongly encourage you to do, you will hear about his work here at UCSD, building the school. And I think you'll also hear some about work that he's still leading today in new leading-edge science with application to bettering humanity. And so I think it's Bob's ability to, and his willingness, frankly, to give the people who work with him the freedom to ask the right questions and to sort of maybe gently nudge them here and there, but nonetheless give them the freedom to do that and occasionally to fail, is one of the traits that I admire the most about Bob and that I'm quite thankful for, because it allowed me to then pursue the things that I was interested in and that I continue with to this day. I should also say you heard from Charlie and from Mohamed and others about the Pisces program that he had the foresight to start in 1984. That program continues to this day on this campus. It is the leading facility in the world for plasma material interactions. It is well funded. It does leading work that impacts ITER. We're beginning to look at issues that will bear on the feasibility or not of a nuclear-based fusion facility that would come in parallel to or after ITER. And yes, we've made a few tweaks here and there, I have to say. But fundamentally, it's still the same, based on the same questions that Bob identified with quite a bit of foresight nearly 30 years ago. And so I just wanted to thank Bob for the opportunity to have worked with him and to have benefited from his mentorship and guidance and friendship. So thank you, Bob. And finally, I wanted to, Charlie Kennel is up in the seats. So as Charlie makes his way down, you've heard about fusion and as an energy source and the profound challenges that presents us for technology and science. Charlie worked with Bob in Los Angeles in the 80s to establish the IPFR, the Institute for Plasma and Fusion Research, and more recently he's now Director Emeritus, but he was a director at SIO for a number of years, leading SIO in its science work in oceanography and climate science. And so I'd like to invite Charlie to share a few words. After Charlie's comments, those of you in the audience who might want to have a few comments, take a few moments to share your own recollections and remembrances, please feel free to sort of wander to the front, and we'll give you a few minutes to have an open mic session as well. Charlie.
So is there a possibility of opening up my slides?
Yeah,
There it is.
Okay.
All right.
Very good.
So I'll let you stare at that for a moment because that's the key diagram for my talk. Foundation. It was Bob that founded it, but in his wisdom, he asked me to be his deputy director, and my job was to keep the physics department happy and under control. And evidently, I succeeded in that. But I've got to tell you that it was a very easy job. I did most of the listening, and he did most of the work. And I thought it was an extraordinary experience for me, largely because I had never encountered fusion engineering before, and I became very impressed with the reactor studies and listened to a number of talks that he and Mohamed and Farrokh made. And I kind of stored all of that information away. And meanwhile, my career took a slightly different direction, but I kept for a while, being roped back into thinking about fusion, and actually it was Bob's thinking that influenced mine the most. I served on the Secretary of Energy's advisory board in '90, I guess. And then subsequent to that time, during the big crisis, and this was a time when my familiarity with the field and skills had declined dramatically, the National Academy, in its wisdom, appointed me chairman of a panel on fusion science, which preceded the John Sheffield panel. And it was actually during that experience and listening again to the arguments that I realized the profundity of the work that Bob was doing. But I also thought at that time that climate change would be one of the main arguments for fusion in the future, and that it would be important to position the fusion programs, one of the rationales for it in that context. And that committee, of course, made a number of recommendations, nearly all of which were ignored or superseded by the subsequent fusion committee that Anne convened. But there's one recommendation that was my favorite that nobody has ever repeat it again. And I'm going to take the selfish opportunity to give you the reasoning for it. And now that I've been at Scripps for a while, I know a little bit more about climate change. So I'm going to spend some time on that. This is a plot that was put together by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its 2001 report. And it just basically shows the logic of CO2 as it interacts with our climate. And the essential point for you to remember is that CO2 has two timescales, both exceedingly long and both related to the great inertia of the Earth's carbon cycle. When we emit fossil fuel CO2 into the atmosphere, about half of it goes into the ocean and half of it stays in the atmosphere. 80% of the energy goes into the ocean. CO2 in the atmosphere has about a 100-year lifetime, and CO2 and heat in the ocean have about a 1,000-year lifetime. And these determine the dynamics of climate warming. And so what you see here is the plot that they made on the very little one in brown is assuming there's our CO2 emissions going up and assuming that at some point they begin to level off, as they are in the United States at the moment as we are shifting from coal to natural gas. CO2 goes down, but what you notice is because of the great 50-year or 100-year lifetime in the atmosphere, CO2 stabilization in the atmosphere doesn't take place until 50 years after we stopped reducing our emissions. The second point is that because most of the energy went into the ocean, it's released even more slowly. So the temperature, the energy that we're putting into the climate system continues to grow for a century or more after we've stabilized CO2. Okay? So let's keep this plot in mind. Forget about sea level rise. IPCC got it wrong, but the bottom three curves are still okay. So keep all of this in mind, and keep one more thing in mind, that if you talk to people in the technical community that don't know much about fusion, they always say, well, it's always 50 years off. It's always 50 years off. And they say it without thinking. It's almost become a mantra. And I claim it's time to think about that issue. The question of when it will become available is critical. And 50 years, as you can see, is just about the right time for it to interact or not with the climate warming problem. So let's see. There we go. Now, the next thing I'm going to show you on the left, that tall plot there, are the four scenarios that the next IPCC report will use in all their calculations. It will come out in 2014. And what you see is three scenarios, four of them, according to the number of watts per meter squared additional infrared energy added to the climate system via human by humans. The path we're on is 8.5 watts per meter squared. That's business as usual, and that will give us about 5 degrees centigrade warming between now and 2100. And to point out the difference between the last ice age and the present warming is also 5 degrees. So that's a profound amount of warming. And everyone has presumed that somehow we're going to limit our CO2 emissions and limit the growth of temperature by the end of the century, and we're going to be on one of those other paths. There's no evidence at all that we're on any path except business as usual. The other remark that's worth making is I'd like to focus on the next 50 years, or say up to 2050, when you see that all of the scenarios are about the same, and that's because most of the warming we're getting today is from and we will get for the next 30 years is from stuff we've already done. But it becomes incredibly important, as you can see from the spread of those curves, what we do in the next 50 or so years. And so there's a cruel logic to CO2 and our strategy associated with it for the next 50 years. And so we have to ask the question, what does it take to be on the path to eventual CO2 stabilization by 2050. And I'm going to say, give you the results of a study that was done here in California. What can California do to put its emission share on that path? Can the world agree to start moving down on a similar path? How rapidly could the global energy system follow through? And when will warming slow once CO2 emissions start to decline? Those are the questions. So here's the study that was made by the California Council on Science and Technology. It was led by Jane Long at Lawrence Livermore and involved about 200 California scientists. As you know, we are legislatively on the path to, we are committed to a path to CO2 stabilization. And that requires that our CO2 emissions must be cut to 80% below 1990 by 2050, which is essentially the Kyoto Protocol. And it's executive order and legislation, and we confirmed it with a ballot initiative. And we have to include population growth and per capita emissions need to decline, therefore, by about 90%. And otherwise, the total emissions would double. There's no magic bullet. There's no single technology that worked. And so the California Council and Jane's panel elected to consider every technology that was demonstrated or on the market, and none that are on the drawing board. And so they also assumed an aggressive deployment of these known technologies with no undue social resistance. So, and there are a variety of paths to get there, various mixes and matches you can make with these existing technologies, but here is a scenario that they considered would work. 30 new nuclear power plants, one per year after 2020. California presently has 6, one disabled and perhaps unlikely to restart. There need to be in place new building standards such that all new buildings have an 80% reduction in building emissions, and every old building in the state retrofitted by 2050, 80%. Redesign the transport system. The one that may work is 58 miles per gallon fleet average for liquid fuels, 87 for including electrical vehicles, and all liquid fuels low carbon. And the key assumption is to transfer as much as possible to a zero emission electrical system, so nuclear and renewables. Electricity consumption would double. You'd have 60% of your light vehicles electrical, smart power transmission grids, obviously, and they argue that California has enough geothermal, wind, and solar capacity that perhaps we could get there. Now, in this study, there's good news, and there's bad news, and there's important news, and the important news is the one I think I will focus on here. Good news, 4/5 of the job could be done with existing technologies. The little plot shows how much you would, BAU is business as usual, and how much you gain by going to building efficiency, to electrification, to low carbon electricity, and finally low carbon fuels. So 4/5 of the job could be done with existing technologies if we could deploy them fast enough. Bad news is that the deployment looks politically and socially very difficult. And so therefore the important news is that innovation is likely to be decisive. Okay? And now at this point we can see that the technically one of the most advanced states in the Union and the one most politically oriented towards solving this problem, we are going to find it difficult or impossible. So what are the probabilities that the rest of the world can meet California-like CO2 emission standards? So in fact, this is the work of our colleague David Victor, who in the School of International Relations. Can the world actually agree on California-like goals? And he would argue that the present UN climate negotiations, which have been going on for the last 20 years, have not in any way materially affected the growth of CO2 emissions. But the negotiations are structured wrong. They require unanimity amongst 183 countries that have diverse interests and conflicting interests within and beyond their borders on the uses of energy and fossil fuels. So he is going to argue that we should start working on it in smaller international groupings with the individual initiatives, both at industry and country levels. Coalitions of the willing, if you will. And in fact, when you don't get to the whole issue of a comprehensive agreement on fossil fuel emission limitation, then you do find a number of international initiatives going forward on a smaller scale. Next slide. Let's see if I can do that. Suppose the world were to agree tomorrow on a comprehensive policy for fossil fuel emission limitation. How long would it take the present energy system globally to respond? So it's clear that the time scale is the order of 30 to 50 years. That's basically the replacement cycle for energy infrastructure. That we also know that energy decision-making is complex and slow, and there are issues, ancillary issues associated with each of the carbon-free energy sources. And finally, there's not in my backyard, which seems to prevent construction of many large projects. Probably the most important fact at the present time is that coal, the least efficient fossil fuel, CO2 efficient fossil fuel, is the principal energy source of the most rapidly growing economies. 95% of the increase in coal consumption between 2000 and 2011 are from two countries alone, China and India. Clean coal technologies are used, high pressure steam and the like, are only used by the most advanced power companies, even in the advanced world, and there has been no demonstration of carbon capture and storage technologies, which are much talked about and much used as a defense of coal, but in fact there has been no demonstration whatsoever. And then finally, low carbon, all the low carbon alternatives require subsidies, and particularly in democracies, are politically and economically fragile. So that's a mistake. Let's get the next one. So on the time scale, the basic point then is that no matter what we do about energy in the short term, and we must do something to preserve the long-term stability of our global civilization. No matter what we do about energy in the short term, it will not have an effect on the climate for at least about 50 years. And so we have to borrow 50 years of carbon emissions from the future in order to finance a new carbon-free energy infrastructure. And we're just borrowing that much climate change from our children, and the order of the day is, in fact, to invest it wisely. And on that time scale, which could very well be the fusion time scale, it would seem to me that there would be something useful that both the fusion program could do, and in fact all of the low-carbon energy technologies, and that is to have an international assessment of their readiness, and exactly when we expect them, when the key problems, many of which Bob's studies started the identification of, when those key problems will be solved, so that over the next few decades, we can plan where to invest in the energy technologies that will save the 21st century. Okay? And so at that point, and I know there are very many studies, but none of them have the authority of the IPCC, the fully international certification, and none of them, as far as I know, deal with the full case for any of these energy technologies. Not only the cost of energy, not only the scientific and technical barriers to be overcome, but the environmental case, the social acceptability case. And so it's the complete case for fusion, and in the long-term assessment thereof was the my favorite recommendation in the 96 study, which was systematically neglected. But I have to say that my inspiration for including that in the report was having worked with Bob Conn, having worked alongside Bob Conn for at least 20 years at UCLA and here. So thank you very much for that, Bob.
A few minutes out. Charles, did you have anything you wanted to share? Or, please. So Charles, too, is a faculty member in electrical engineering and also associate dean of the School of Engineering. Charles.
Thank you very much for giving me right now. So I want to take this opportunity to thank Bob to best wishes for his 70th birthday, but also to thank him again for saving my life. In 1999, when Bob was the Dean of Engineering, and he asked me to be the department chair of electrical and computer engineering. And during that time, I was in the period of midlife crisis, as my daughter said it. Because I was learning how to do paragliding. And just 1 month after I started my lessons, my instructors, who had 5,000 hours of flying, died in a paragliding accident at the glider port. And that really shook my self-confidence. You know, I had less than 5 minutes of flying. And but I continued the lessons because I already paid for them. But then I crash landed. You know, I lost self-confidence. I crash landed. I had to go to the emergency room. But then Bob asked me, to be the chair, and I said, okay, I'll think about it, and I'll tell you in a week. But during that time, I had another lesson, and I crash landed again. And I went to the emergency room again, and this time it was more serious. So when I went to Bob's office to say that, so when I went to Bob's office, I was in clutches. And I told him that, okay, I accept to be the chair, and I promise to be safe. So so here I am today. Yeah. So thank you very much, Bob. Happy birthday.
Please.
Edward Cheng, who was a student of Dr. Conn's lab in the nuclear engineering department at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. My father-in-law can't be here today due to an illness, but it was critically important to him that I be here today to deliver this message to Dr. Conn. As a PhD student of Bob, I would like to congratulate Bob for his outstanding achievements in enhancing the knowledge of energy and life sciences for mankind at this special birthday symposium. When I came to America in 1972, Bob guided me as a young man still learning English, new to a new culture that's so different from the one that I knew. He guided me in writing my first reports, abstracts to the ANS meetings, and taught me. Under his mentorship, I was able to grow new roots in the scientific community and establish a passion for science that still burns in me today. After earning my PhD, Bob left me alone to carve my own path in a career of scientific research. One of the many things I learned from Bob was that intellectual freedom and independent thinking are critically important to the process of finding scientific truth and enhancing its value for mankind. Thank you very much, Bob, for this important lesson that I've recalled many times throughout my life. Happy birthday.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Please make your way forward.
My name is Maurice Sabato. Many of you don't know me, but I've had a long relationship with Bob for many, many years. I also want to, characterize the development of fusion and some significant, I thought, changes. And one of them I have to point out is Steve Dean. Steve Dean was the person who essentially met commercial fusion in a commercial company, General Atomic, to happen. He made the decision that he wanted to bring industry in, and so he allowed for D3 to be built. Now, D3 was an interesting time. Charlie Baker was there. We were designing this machine, and we designed it with a lot of different ideas, mainly because we were all aerospace engineers. So the Tohiro decided he would introduce engineers, aerospace engineers who had built large things, and he would bring those in and merge those with the, essentially the scientists, and that was a big change. So this was all happening in the 70s, so it was a significant change in the way things are. So the demountable coil that we built into D3 allowed the change for the essentially the doublet reactor to the big D. Those the change to making a corrugated sandwich and cooling the vacuum vessel internally. Princeton always designed their reactors were having all the colloidal and the E-field coils all in stainless steel cans. We decided that we understood how to analyze these coils, and essentially we would put the loads through the structure, through the coils themselves, make them part of the structure. There was a big change, and I just want to, again, point that out. But during the time I went from D3 to TFTR at Princeton, with Bob Conn, I was introduced to him, and I started working with him. And what I really liked about it with Bob is that he started including engineers like myself on all the review panels. All these studies that went through, he would bring engineers into it to start looking at these things from an engineering point of view. Not the physics of it, but yet, can it be built? What are the ideas that you can bring to it? What could you change in the materials? So, for example, at D3, one of the things I was asked to do by Tohiro was to analyze the limiters that were always failing on D2. And what I determined was it was the tungsten limiters were being failing by recrystallization. It was the light bulb effect. You heat a light bulb up, if you shake it, it'll break. And so I read that and presented that to Tohiro, and I changed that materials in the limiters for D3 to tantalum-10 tungsten and TZM. And so TZM was the material was on the first wall. These were things that we decided to change based on engineering analysis. And so during that whole period, what I liked about one of the things about Bob is he'd stop and talk to you about engineering material science. He would really want to delve into the issues that were there. So I really appreciated the fact that Bob was bringing about a big change in the way we saw things, and that you couldn't just continue to go on the path of it was going to be a science project. It was going to have to be engineered. So with that, Bob, I really appreciate the contributions and the changes you made, the way we saw things that should be done. Okay, I really appreciate it, and thank you for all the opportunities you gave me.
Looks like we have a traveling mic now, so it'll make it easier. Please.
My name is Takashi. I've known Bob Conn for more than 40 years. Hello, I'm Gerald Avertil from Columbia University. And before I was an undergrad at Caltech. to me that a recent former doctoral student of his had just gone to the faculty at the University of Wisconsin and was setting up a program in fusion energy, which is the area I wanted to do my graduate studies in. And so he sent me there, and I visited in the summer, talked to Bob. He told me about the program. I got a tour of the various facilities, the experiments there, was very impressed, and so I applied to graduate school. It was also a very important visit because didn't realize it at the time, but in the tour of the labs, I met the woman who would later become my wife, working on one of the experiments. And so I, in fact, finished then in '76, and I've been at Columbia University on the faculty there, really ever since. And so I've known Bob for a long time. I've had the pleasure of working with him in a variety of capacities. And I think, as Farrokh alluded to, one of the high points of working with Bob was the period when he was chair of FEAC, Fusion Energy Advisory Committee. And when the program was in crisis, and in a certain sense was in free fall, Bob had, I guess, the insight and the courage to put a group of young 38-year-olds, 37-year-olds on a committee of scientific advisors. It was chaired by Jim Callan, who was the only older member of the group. I was the vice chair. But it was an exciting time, and it was really an effort by us to essentially try to restructure the program and stabilize it and set the stage for it coming back and continuing as a program toward energy. And I think, as was commented, we've been on that path for 17 years. It isn't necessarily the path that we all would have preferred to be on, but it was a path, and it brought us to this point where we are building ITER. And so, Bob, I really appreciated knowing and working with you all these years. Hopefully, we'll be in touch for many more decades. Happy birthday.
And knowing Bob, I was going to offer him the chance at the last word. So let me first see with our audience if there's any other, I've got a little bit with the Klieg lights here, a little bit difficult to see, any other desire to come up forward. Doesn't look like it. So Bob, I will turn the podium over to you, and then I would invite those of you who are here to share in some refreshments afterwards. A little bit more time for social
I just listened, and I thought I'm going to go back through the program from bottom to top just to say a comment or two. The thing that moves me the most is how many people referred to the importance of people. Let them run. You can figure out how to do course corrections, but don't try to tell them what to do, particularly if they're smart. And somebody just mentioned, Jerry, at the end, Noel Korngold. So Noel Korngold was my PhD advisor at Caltech in the mid-'60s. And the lesson of the 25%, now, was it Farrokh who mentioned the 25%, and was it George who said, I'd never tell you what to do, but I'd always tell you what I thought, right? About what you thought, which is different. That came from Noel. That came from Caltech. And it came from a time when I wish we had more of, which was very strong government support for basic science. So when I was a graduate student, I didn't have to work for anybody because the money was coming from the National Science Foundation, graduate fellowships, and so on. It wasn't coming from a grant of a faculty member. It's a fundamental difference. So I got to choose who I worked with. And they thought, you have to think about it. And the lesson that Noel had, which I heard throughout this day, it's the old thing, it's almost biblical about, if I give you a fish, you eat for a day. If I give you a rod and teach you to fish, you have food for life. It was the same idea. If you learn as a graduate student, what is an important research problem? What is the process by which you decide what is important as a problem of any kind, scientific or otherwise?
then you'll always be able to figure out the best path to the most important problem, and that'll allow you to make a difference. And I think that lesson, if I think about it, is what happened to me everywhere. Even to this day, I think at the Kavli Foundation, if we do everything together and if we look down the road, and I have some freedoms to act, what leadership could I give and what difference could we make? What's the most important problem? So I am thrilled that so many people sort of got that. I had no idea, right? If you're on the other side of the table, you're doing this, but then people go off, they make their lives. And you don't always know what stuck and what didn't. You just kind of hope maybe this works out okay. And from what I heard from you, it seems that it has. I was very delighted to hear from Edward. Edward's got some medical difficulties right now, and I'm in touch with him. I'm going to go see him on Saturday. But he wrote me a note that was very touching about the naming of his son. Not the naming, but the birth. His son was born on December 15th, and he wrote me recently in a note, which I had to explain, that I said to him when his son was born, he came in with a cigar, we lit up the cigar, we talked. And this was, I guess we could smoke in the office at Wisconsin, and I smoked a cigar. And he said, I said one thing to him. I said, it's too bad he was born so close to Christmas. And what I meant by that was he'll get 2 gifts, and then he's got 11 months. And I'm born December 1st, so Charlie, I actually am older than you. But he remembered this. 45 years later, he's got this story about how he took this meeting together, how I was congratulatory. And it was moving to me, and I had to tell him the reason I said that. I learned recently from my 98-year-old mother why I got a horseback ride in June when I was sort of 8, 9, 10, 11. We didn't have any money, so a horseback ride for an hour was a big deal. And my father would always take me. And the answer to the question was she felt sorry that I would go 11 months without getting a present. And so in the middle of the year, she would. That must have stuck with me, and I shared it with your father-in-law. And I'm sure your husband, Eric, has never had a complaint. But anyway, let me go back just a little bit through some of the things. Charlie talked about climate. You know, the reason that many of us of my generation became interested in nuclear power and nuclear energy and fusion was because we actually wanted to make the world better. In 40 or 50 years, the whole idea of nuclear power has somehow become the bogeyman for things that are not good, for technology gone wrong. But in those days, if you were a graduate student at Caltech and could not see the mountains for 11 months a year, you knew we needed something. And nuclear energy was, and is to this day, one of the solutions to many of those problems, not just air pollution and so on, but if we're going to make the kind of progress that Charlie talked about, we're going to need things like fusion. And if the time scale is 50 years, fusion, better nuclear, and so on, I think can make a difference. So Charlie, thanks for bringing that up. Charlie Baker, I remember as a graduate student when I arrived, and I'm impressed by how odd I must have looked to everybody, because everybody commented about the long hair. By the way, one of the things that hasn't changed is the hairline has not adjusted in all those years, but the length and the amount, that all has changed. But it was great about enabling teams. Charlie was one of those people who always led teams. And so many of you talked about teams. And I thank you for recognizing that. People are everything. People are everything. And if you put them together, if you give them an ambitious goal, you apply that Noel Korngold rule, let them go, let them go, let them go. Daikai talked about the idea, go figure it out, Daikai, go figure it out. You can figure it out. How about this? How about that? What do you think about this? I visited with Jerry 2 years ago. He told me afterwards, we had a nice meeting with your current graduate students and some of your postdocs. We went to dinner together, and he said to me, I warned them all, be ready for a tough set of questions. And that was not to intimidate anybody ever, but it was always to force critical thinking, always to force them to go further than they thought. And I was good at connecting dots. I mean, somebody commented about how I listened. Ken, I guess you said at a meeting. I mean, if I have a strength, I can see a lot of things and see the whole picture. I've always had that ability. I don't know where the hell it comes from, but I shouldn't fib about it. I'm 70, right? So that was an ability I seemed to have. It was why the reactor studies were so attractive to me, because I could see it from the physics right out to the end game. And when you put a team together, you need to be able to see all of that. So all of you were part of some of those teams, and I'm glad to hear that you felt empowered, you know, that old-fashioned empowered, enabled. Go break it. Farrokh, I remember giving that lecture at Berkeley. You know, the reason I remember, I left Wisconsin, which was fabulous to me. I mean, frankly, it made my career, those early days. And you go to a new place. What do? You got to find the best people. So I went on a tour. I didn't only give a lecture at Berkeley. I went to MIT. I went to Wisconsin. I went to Berkeley. I went here, I went there, and I gave these talks with the hope that people like you would somehow say, hey, I might like to go there and work on that problem. That happened. Brian LeBombard came for the same reason. In the late 80s, I thought we need renewal. I'm going to go on a tour. I gave a bunch of lectures at all these places, met the folks, and a new generation of people came to work with us. We renewed the enterprise, right? So renewal, go out there, meet the people, bring them. At least 25% of the time, go do what you want to do, maybe more. Mohamed remarked about going to see the chancellor. Of all that you said, it's literally true. You will find, for the 40 years I've been involved in things, they got the dumbest rules and bureaucracies you can imagine. They were true here at UC San Diego when I tried to get industry involved and tried to get better tech transfer. Simple things like, you know, if you have a great idea and a startup company begins, the university will be better off taking shares in the company than actually having an IP licensing agreement. Because an IP licensing agreement will force the company immediately to want to go in a new direction so they don't have to pay you a fee. But if you give them shares, you're aligned. They win, you win. They change the direction, which almost every startup company does. Some don't, but many do. And they finally succeed. You got shares, you win. You got an IP agreement, you lose. Took forever to get that changed, but we got it changed. So going to see Chuck Young. We cannot have these kind of rules where you have subcontracts and they're going to take 80% of Mohamed's money and give it to the overhead people. You got to change the rules. And Chuck made a phone call, and Mohamed had one of the more successful programs in fusion nuclear technology there ever was. He couldn't have done it if you don't get people out of the way. So it's not only to include, that's the story, but, you know, get people out of the way. Get some of the rules out of the way. I'm not going to tell this tomorrow, but I saw Nick Spitzer here. And Nick, when I came here, was chair of the Academic Senate in some period. And the approach that I had to have, because we were doing so many radical things in the School of Engineering, everybody thought we were going to just break everything, was to say everything was an experiment. Everything was an experiment. Nick, just let us try it for 3 years. If the Senate doesn't like it, come and tell us that, and we'll change it or we'll cancel it, but treat it as an experiment. Let's do it for 5 years, right? So how to take risk, how to formulate your way forward so that you don't gore everybody's ox and get through the wickets. Yeah, so I'm happy that it made such a big difference for you early on, because that was right after you came. And that, I think, was important. Steve, I thank you for coming and also bringing Ann Davies' really heartfelt letter. Steve very much helped enable Jerry and I do what we did in the 70s. And they applied a rule that a lot of people were talking about here today: bring the young people in and let them become part of the club and hear their radical ideas. When they were thinking about having this machine he referred to as TFTR, which is the tokamak fusion test reactor, the Department of Energy, during the height of the energy crisis, wanted to figure out how they could show that fusion could be a player. And everybody said, what we have to do is show we can get break even. You put a watt in, you got a watt out. And they held a meeting, and I think it was in December. It was between Christmas and New Year. And the reason I know this is I was on vacation in California, and I got on a plane the day after Christmas, flew to Washington. You must have flown from Madison. And we were invited to join this meeting. And it was the wisdom of Bob Hirsch and Steve and others to say, if we're going to do this, we need the engineering as well as the physics. And so we were the young people. That was the first time I actually really got to know Steve. I met Ken Fowler at that meeting, who showed a generosity I always modeled. He came up to me and said, I'm Ken Fowler, head of the program at Lawrence Livermore. I said, I'm a pipsqueak. I'm at Wisconsin. Hello. This was a person who was running a very large program at a national laboratory, and Jerry and I were arriving as relative newcomers. That inclusion made all the difference. And your recognition of what we were trying to do and how it would help the program made all the difference. And so it was a virtuous interaction. And people don't often say that about governments and government agencies, but the truth is it was very well thought through. And then to Jerry. So aside my graduate work and so on, I went to Wisconsin. This is a story about, the chairman's name was Max Carbon. I came out to interview, and I gave that lecture that somebody spoke about. And I guess Mohamed, right? And Max asked me, Max Carbon, grand old man of the department there, said to me, and we got this idea about working on plasma physics and fusion. Would you be interested in doing that? We want to do this, and we really would like you to do this. And remember, now I'm pretty young, and I went back out to California, sat down with my advisor, Noel Korngold. I said, they want me to work on fusion. I don't want to do that. Here's what I want to do. I want to do this, I want to do this, I want to do this, right? I had all my ideas. They want me to do something. And by the way, this is the lesson of giving you all 25% time. Go think for yourself. And Noel said to me something I also never forgot. So I hope I was as good an advisor as he was to you all as he was to me. He said, Bob, you go to a new place, find out what people are interested in. And maybe think about taking part of your time and working on that. And when you do a good job of working on that, they're going to like you so much they'll let you do anything you want. What a lesson. And so I tried to apply that when I went. But I went there, and they were doing this cockamamie stuff on fusion. And I said, well, I took plasma physics from Roy Gould. I ought to know something about this. Let me see what this is all about. And within 2 or 3 years, Jerry became my partner. He joined the faculty, I think, 2 years after I did. When did you? 72? Late 71. So a year or two afterwards. And we formed what today is their Fusion Technology Institute. It became a partnership. We made innumerable trips to Washington together for budgets for this, that, and the other thing. Steve mentioned about laser fusion and inertial confinement fusion. In those days, it was entirely classified. And I'm going to close on a joke, but I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for that partnership over those 10 years, Jerry. For the two of us, it made such a difference in terms of everything that happened at Wisconsin. You showed that graph. Mohamed is a product of it. Charlie is a product of it. I mean, it was really quite the time. So for all of that, I really thank you. I want to close on a literary note. So Jerry showed a slide at the beginning of all those reactor studies from the 1970s. UMAC 1, UMAC 2 stood for University of Wisconsin, Tokamak 1, 2, 3, et cetera. And then he showed these laser fusion studies called SOLAS. SOLAS 1 and SOLAS H, which was the hybrid study. So the closing little story is the literary part. What's SOLAS? Where did that word come from? So do you remember this story? So I had a friend in the English department, and I loved the people in the literature department here too. Steve Cox was a really good friend of mine. So I went to him. He was a Joyce Scholar. And those were the days when everything got named, you know, quarks and 4 quarks for Mr. Marx, and that's how quark came up and so on. I said, I got this project we're working on. And they won't let us see the essence of it. It's classified. What this target looks like and how it works. We know it implodes. We know it's supposed to then give more energy out than in. But we don't know anything about how this works. Somehow that's the middle of a hydrogen bomb, and okay, we can't figure this out. So it's like, you know, feeling all this stuff, but you don't know the essence in the middle. And he said, well, what are some of the things it's about? And I said, well, we're trying to do fusion. That's the energy source of the stars, you know, the sun and so on. So. And then we have lasers, and we're going to shine these lasers on this little thing, that target that's at the head of a pin, and we're going to implode it with millions of joules of energy, and we're going to get even more millions of joules back out. But we don't know anything about this. So we're in darkness. We got these lasers. We want to do things the same as this. He found me a phrase. You take your solace from the dorkedness, from Finnegan's Wake. And solace meant solace. You take your solace from the darkness. You can't know everything. You take your solace from the darkness and you go on. That's sort of a lesson in life I took from that quote. And it's how we got the name. The first laser fusion project, funded not by the DOE, but by the Electric Power Research Institute, because they didn't have the constraints that the DOE had. I want to thank you for coming. This has been a journey down memory lane. It's so marvelous to see so many people I work so closely with again. Tomorrow, I think, is going to be more. But the truth is, tomorrow began in 1993. Today began in 1970. And so this has been a remarkable day for me. Thank you so much for coming.